For them, and it's a great opportunity for my union.
Not First Nations.
We gotta have a future for these young guys. That's why I'm pushing for this new prosperity.
So what are British Columbians saying?
Resource sector is what keeps BC's economy going.
Does BC benefit from a growing resource economy?
It's a simple answer, yes.
Say yes to jobs and yes to BC.
Personal gun rights versus state gun control. It's been a hotly contested debate in the United States, but now for the first time in more than 2 decades, there's more support for the right to own a gun than for controlling guns. That's according to a new Pew Research Center survey, and they're on the left. 52% of those polled say it is more important to protect individual gun ownership rights, while just 46% say it's more important to control gun ownership. Criminal defense lawyer Solomon Friedman joins us with more from Ottawa. Isn't this interesting, Solomon? And I read the study a couple days ago, but if I recall correctly, one of the largest changes is the number of African Americans, Black Americans, who support gun ownership. Maybe it's in response to crime, maybe it's in response to some of the racial worries or police worries, but I like it when Americans take their liberties seriously and start to protect themselves, their property, and their families with their own wits and property. I like the fact that Americans like their guns, and I love the fact that minority Americans do too.
Yeah, and in fact, this is actually the continuation of a trend that we saw on the legal side. The 2 biggest challenges in the United States that went to the Supreme Court of the United States that overturned handgun bans in Washington, D.C. and in Chicago were both initiated by African Americans living in neighborhoods that tend to be more poor and more crime-ridden. And in both those cases, the Supreme Court struck down these handgun bans. So we have that trend. The law is becoming clarified. It is now a matter of settled law in the United States that the purpose of the Second Amendment is for self-defense and self-protection. But we're also seeing another factor here, which is just the narrative that guns cause crime and guns cause violence has been so repudiated by study after study that I think it's actually starting to sink into the national consciousness.
I think you're right, and our friend Dr. John Lott has certainly led the battle on the statistics there. You know, you and I both love the band NWA, and one of their songs, 911's a joke. You know, to guys like you and me who live in safe neighborhoods, 911 is not a joke. We would call 911 and the police would be there in minutes. But for people in rougher parts of town, they call 911. Sometimes the cops don't even want to go. I'm talking about the United States much more than in Canada, of course. I'm talking about those areas in Chicago and Washington, D.C. and Detroit that you mentioned. And so, in a way, it's those rich, liberal, white anti-gun activists who live in safe communities, who maybe even have personal protection. I think of, for example, Mayor Michael Bloomberg of New York, who had his own personal armed detachment, or even Piers Morgan, the CNN host, who had an armed guard. So these rich white liberals who are in no jeopardy, telling poor people, usually minorities, you can't have guns, but I can. There was something a little bit racist and classist about that. Am I being too Marxist to say that, Solomon?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And the real way to identify this problem is to correlate major pieces of gun legislation with different periods in American history. So if you look in the 1930s, your first spate of gun control legislation is really about keeping guns away from undesirables. And in that case, it's unionists, communists, Bolsheviks, etc. And then in the 60s, it's about the Black Power movement and ensuring that these marginalized minorities don't take up arms. So gun control has often been a narrative of keeping guns out of the hands of the wrong people. Sure, if you're a limousine liberal or a champagne socialist, your self-protection, your bodyguards can all carry guns, no problem. And Bloomberg's a great example of that. But at its core, it's often about ensuring that the other doesn't have guns. And we're seeing that narrative start to turn.
Yeah. I think of the recent riots in Ferguson. Many of the buildings that were torched were Black-owned businesses, Black-run businesses. And I just know that if those shopkeepers had stood out front of their own business with a visible AR-15, the civilian version of the M16, and told the rioters, you better move on, I'm certain of it, because it reminds me of the riots that we saw in L.A. when it was often the Korean shopkeepers who were standing with their guns. I think if more Black shopkeepers had firearms, they would be victimized less That's my thesis. And I'm not making this just about blacks, but my recall of that Pew survey is that some of the biggest changes in numbers were amongst minorities. Last thoughts to you, Solomon.
Yeah, I think that sort of instinct that we have about firearms and the positive benefit they can have in terms of self-protection is borne out by the empirical evidence. You know, I'm a guy who relies on rock-solid evidence, and there has been study after study that positively correlates handgun carry rate in the United States or, you know, firearms laws that allow people to use their guns for self-protection with lower crime rates, lower rates of violent crime, and even lower rates of firearm crime. So I think not only is this an instinct, and you're right about it, but it's borne out by the evidence as well.
Yeah, I mean, I got a simple question for you. Would you rob a gun store? No, you probably wouldn't. But would you rob a store that had the sign, "This is a gun-free zone"? You absolutely would. And as Dr. Lott proves, most of the gun sprees in America happen in these gun-free zones because the criminals are not stupid. They know they have a greater chance of shooting and killing more people before they're shot in those so-called gun-free zones. Solomon, let's continue this conversation another day. It's such a pleasure.